morning to this first panel discussion. It was good hearing Harbinder and then Manish before this session. What I thought I'd do in this panel on timely policy making in cementing India's leadership in the Web3 innovation was to actually give each of the panelists just 30 seconds to introduce themselves so that you know who they are. And then I'd pose a series of questions to each one of them. Hopefully, we'll open it up to a question from the audience and then end this session. So with that, I think, Kaushal, could you just begin by...
Thank you, sir. My name is Kaushal Mahan. I am Vice President at Chase India, which is a public policy consulting firm. And with around 14 years of experience, I've been working on tech policies, and interestingly, Web3 is one of the new areas, but on major policy issues on tech sector.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Manish here. Been doing gaming for 13 years. Started my own gig last year. Prior to that was Nazara's CEO, and have been fortunate to work with Dilip in shaping gaming. So here, love to see how can we shape Web3 over next decade.
I am Damodaran. I am a professor at ICRIAR, New Delhi. Now, before this, I just moved in about 5 months ago to ICRIAR. Before this, I was in Bangalore. I was a professor at IIM Bangalore. And my career began as a policymaker way back in 1985. So you can understand when I mentioned 1985, I think Manish, you mentioned about 1984 Orwell, but I am pretty ancient in this crowd. And to be talking about Web3, being with a group of very vibrant people, I think I am the odd person out. But that's for all now.
Hi, I'm Meghna. I head research at SES Center, which is a technology policy focused think tank. I started my career largely in policy and specifically technology policy, looking actually at the intersection of blockchain and how it can improve governance. And then I quickly shifted to the private sector, where I ran and set up the India office for Consensus, which is a global blockchain startup, and then was in media. I joined Disney for a couple of years, and now I'm here. So looking forward to this discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Meghna. I should have started with you, but anyway. So you heard both Harbinder and Manish earlier about Web3. One of the things which both of them alluded to but did not mention was, unlike Web 1 and Web 2, Web3 allows each one of you as a customer or as a consumer of internet services or creating content is actually to monetize your content. That is something which neither Web 1 or Web 2 did. And I'm Dilip Chenoy. I currently chair the Bharat Web3 Association. The Bharat Web3 Association is a very new association that is trying to get industry together to actually position India as the global capital for Web3. We believe that Web3 has the potential to actually generate $1 trillion of economic wealth for the country. And the difference between this is not centralized economic wealth, but decentralized economic wealth. If you can, it's actually each one of you as consumers will be able to get that. And it offers a tremendous opportunity to do things in a different way. But for that to happen, we need a very interesting governance framework and policy making. We've actually, for those of you who've been following the news last 3 days, there have been meetings in Gandhinagar with the G20 looking at policy making in one small sliver of the Web3 space. And fortunately, that small sliver is dominating the conversation and overshadowing the conversation there. So what we thought we'll do, and with Professor Damodaran, if I can just go to you, and if I could, from your perspective, what do you see, as the Web3? What is the kind of, opportunity there? What's the framework, and how you can go ahead, right?
Um, Thank you, Chair. Well, let me put myself in the shoes of a policymaker and look at the issue of Web3. Now, I have two ways of looking at it. One is I look at the positives. The other one is that I look at the negatives and then try to see the balance between the two. And if I am a little more friendly to what I am looking at, then I'll try to find out how to minimize the negatives and have some safeguards or some remedial measures, and then come to a decision. Decision regarding the formulation of the policy, right? Now, if you look at Web3, as Mr. Dilip Chenoy mentioned, Web3 is way different from its predecessors in the sense that, first of all, I think that flows from what you mentioned. Web3 has to be recognized, unlike its predecessors, as a global common. Now, it is no less an important global issue. It is not a national issue. It is a global issue, like climate change and biodiversity and stuff like that, which we negotiate in multilateral environmental forums. So the first axiom or the first premise is that the policymaker recognizes Web3 as a global common. Now, the second is that this is a global common which is not run by nation states. It is run by decentralized communities. Now, that came out very strongly when Manish spoke. Decentralization is the philosophy of Web3. Now, that, if you accept these two as a first set of axioms, then you can proceed to the next. The next is that it is a technological innovation of a very, very fundamental nature. I mean, fundamentally revolutionizing nature. Because it has to push decentralization, and therefore it has to go for a technology which, of course, we all know it is blockchain-driven system. But more important than all that is, this is driven, Web3 would be driven by virtual digital assets which are cryptographically protected. Now that is a second assumption or the premise for policymaking. Now against this background, you are supposed to take a look at what happens to the GDP, the country's GDP, what happens to the job markets, what happens to the labor market, and then look at the negatives. Now negatives are well known, because I don't have to labor on that point. It is very well reported. Negatives are basically the macroeconomic issues, macroeconomic stability issues, addressed at the global as well as the national level. There are concerns that the currencies or the virtual digital assets can destabilize the currencies of the country. So that is a very typical stand. And secondly, the activities associated with dark web and other money laundering and stuff like that. That is the first negative. The second negative, of course, is sustainability issue, because, you know, it is, the Web3 debates have been linked to climate change and our action on climate change. So those are the two negatives. Now imagine that you start with the negatives and then don't look at anything else. Then you will have a set of policies which may be restrictive. But if you start with the first premise and go to the second and then go into the third and fourth, then you will get a different configuration of policies. So this is based on my own experience with policies and policy making. Always start on the positives, but it all depends on what is the narrative at that moment. We are all reading from media, we are all influenced by media to believe certain things. Objective policy making basically means this.
Very well put. Now, that sort of sets the stage for Manish. So, Manish, if you look at yourself as an entrepreneur, right? You've taken a dark leap of faith in this. So, what are some of the, challenges and opportunities, and how could you make, let's say, India, and how could you help scale and replicate companies like yourself?
So, if you look at the premise, and I'll just kind of continue to build what Professor said, is the starting point is that you need to think of a global nation or global network state. And second is decentralization. There would be the fundamental, what the challenges would be about controls and how much to kind of let it go. And this is exactly nothing different when a child grows and the child wants to fly and the parents wants to control. It is exactly the same thing, which is happening at a nation level in each country. And we are not sitting in some country which is grappling with this and other countries have figured it out. With the global boundaries being dissolved, this is a issue which every government is grappling with, that there is a huge groundswell of adoption of this new way of community-led commerce, where you can use your disposable time and disposable skill and put it for earning into currencies you believe are the currencies of future, versus the government want to maintaining the status quo. I think that's the fundamental challenge, and that really creates huge amount of perception-led fear among the mind of youngsters versus their parents. I run a gaming company and I meet 16, 18, 19-year-olds whose parents are saying, hey, listen, you should not be playing a blockchain-based game. You should not be putting your time and skill to build NFTs and kind of really using those NFTs to trade, because in their mind, this is not legal. Now, there is no legal illegal in law. Law comes much later. It is in the minds of people, it is in the common perception that what do we accept as legal and what do we accept as illegal, and where my own child or my own fear really gets amplified. I think that's the biggest Dilip challenge which we need to really look at. And that's where positive narratives beyond that sliver of thinking which you spoke about needs to happen on the use cases which can fundamentally have socio-economic impact on job creation, financial inclusion. And if we are able to demonstrate that through use cases, through adoption, I think, and amplify those human stories, we would be able to make some dent over a period of time.
Thank you, Manish, and that actually leads nicely into you, Meghna. You've been doing a lot of work on international regulation, and surprisingly, when we look at G20 and we are talking about a global regulation, but Indonesia, who was the previous chair of G20, has actually gone and announced a lot of their own national level kind of regulations, including a list of 250 tokens which can be traded in an exchange which they run. So, from your perspective, where you said what is happening globally and what is it that we could look at in India?
Thank you. I think globally, when we consider the G20, so I'll give you an instance of a study that we recently did. We wanted to test this hypothesis that essentially there is a divergence between advanced and emerging market economies in terms of how they approach this space. And the hypothesis has been propounded by policymakers and other decision makers, as well as officials from international financial organizations and regulators, that there would be a divergence between emerging market economies because they're smaller, they're more at risk from things like financial stability, et cetera, and advanced economies. So we said, okay, let's quantify this, let's test this. So we took the regulatory positions of the different countries in the G20, and it creates a really nice sample set because there are an equivalent number of emerging market and advanced economies within this grouping. And we found that, one, the motivations are not very different across both groupings. The only real difference is that more emerging market economies look at regulation of the VDA space as a means to enhance their technological competitiveness and innovation. But otherwise, both of them look at it from a standpoint of, hedging against consumer, investor, and business risk, addressing financial stability concerns, and of course, addressing concerns regarding money laundering and countering terror finance. Now, if you look at the other parameters we considered is, of course, where all is it legal? And in most countries within the G20, again, both in emerging market and advanced economies, it is legal. There's only one country that is officially banned it, and that is China. Then when we move on to things like licensing, there's a higher degree of licensing that has been instituted in advanced economies, but that's because they're further ahead in their regulatory journey. And that's not to say that there aren't forms of licensing within emerging market economies as well, like Dr. Chenoy said in the case of Indonesia and other countries as well. Finally, while it is legalized in most countries, there are restrictions that have been placed, and again, there's quite a variety. So either there are restrictions placed on financial institutions from directly offering dealings in virtual digital assets. So in Mexico and Argentina, there are restrictions on banks from dealing directly in these markets. Or there are restrictions on specific activities like ICOs. For instance, in the case of South Korea, there's a ban on ICOs because they think that it's a huge consumer protection risk. But in France, they've taken a different approach. You have to take permission from the regulator before you can carry out an ICO. The point is that there are restrictions that are being placed, and of course the most notable restriction that has been placed is on privacy coins, because they confound any kind of traceability because they are completely anonymous. In terms of coming to consensus on a global framework, there are two areas which I see as key. One is taxation, and the other one is money laundering. So in the context of taxation and money laundering, the thing is that if you don't have a common minimum or a common framework across countries, then there's opportunity for arbitrage. And we saw that in India. We actually carried out another study on this. We saw that when the current tax regime was brought in, there was an offshoring of 32,000 crores from India in this space, primarily because the taxation regime was so punitive. In the context of other countries, like in Indonesia, we've seen that it did not lead the imposition of a tax because it was, the tax was imposed, but the amount or the quantum was not extreme or was not punitive. There wasn't that much offshoring, and in fact, volumes have increased over there. So that is one thing to consider, is that if you have punitive regulation, because it is a global space, people will find ways to access platforms in other countries, and that leads to other kinds of risks as well, which is what regulators are really concerned about: offshoring, movement of money abroad, movement of money through assets that they can't really detect, etc., etc. And of course, the other thing is money laundering, which again is about traceability of transactions. And here as well, we've seen that not only in India, although India has just started instituting regulations towards this, but studies carried out by the FATF have found, investigations carried out by the FATF have found that most countries are not compliant with the standards that they have set for AML. So I think these are two areas that can be, where the consensus can be found, because there are global standards and there is precedent both in tax and in AML.
Thanks, Meghna. So, a common minimum on tax, which the G20 actually has done in another case. And of course, anti-money laundering, which the FSP paper doesn't talk about. But there is a different there. So, Kaushal, coming to you, looking at what Professor said, and then Manish, and then Meghna, what could be the opportunity for India to legislate? And also, it's not necessarily this space. There are other aspects of the Web3 that come under different legislation. So what would be the opportunity for India to legislate here?
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Business World, first of all, for this opportunity. I think I'll talk from my experience specifically when on tech regulations, how have they worked mostly across center and states. I think we need to move out from the traditional regulatory structures which we have been doing now to an optimum regulatory structure. What I mean by optimum is both risk focus and risk proportionate. So you also capture only the high risk and don't focus too much on the medium risk and the low risk, because that then leaves the objectivity of the entire technology as part of it. How can we do it? I think we need to look for a hub and spoke model, which we have been suggesting to various central government agencies over days. You need to have a nodal ministry which is looking at two tasks. The first task is kind of identifying the high risk associated with Web3 and then working with the existing regulations. They are all existing regulations, and I'll elaborate more on those, which can cover those risks as part of it. And the second part is, how do you encourage innovation? By helping startups, by developing the skill set required, by providing the right kind of research and research funds to these things. So that you are becoming much more IP generating from here rather than being just a consumer market of Web3. So taking to the second point, I think if I look at the existing set of regulations, there are some regulations which are already there. For example, the tax and the PMLA, which covers the VDA markets. Consumer Protection Act is already there. That covers misleading ads. That covers celebrity endorsements. That covers consumer grievance protections, your aspects to it. We have an IT Act, or I would say Digital India Bill, which is coming soon, and which talks about encouraging innovation while ensuring consumer protection and also the risk management. So why can't we look at classification of Web3 as an intermediary and maybe on use cases? And depending on the use cases, the level of compliance or the support required from an intermediary can change on as part of it. Cyber security, it's already covered. On most of the VDAs are already covered. There's a new cyber policy which is expected soon also. That is also talking about Web3. So again, what I'm trying to establish from this point is, we have a couple of regulations which cover the most of the high risks associated with the Web3 ecosystem. Do we need to kind of, again, put up a curtail or use those existing ecosystems? And the perfect model could be, again, that the IT ministry, Ministry of Electronics and IT, has an emerging technology division whose core focus is to promote innovation and cutting edge technology. They have schemes like Samriddhi and a couple of few Tide. So why can't that become the nodal hub for the Web3 ecosystem? And then work with the different consumer affairs on the consumer part, taxation part, and kind of address all those issues. In that way, we address all the high risk associated. Just lastly, one small example I think I'd like to quote here is, this is happening in other domains. SEBI sandbox, IRDA sandbox, we have IFSAC sandboxes, we have central ministries who are coming with regulatory sandboxes and kind of promoting those over there. We recently saw a paper by TRAI. They're looking at emerging, not only emerging technologies, emerging services, but also emerging business models for digital communication sector. So we have those precedents. I think what we need to do collectively as an industry and the ecosystem is, we need to reach out to the stakeholders, the government stakeholders, and kind of push for creating that adoption of Web3 as their core focus areas and then looking at the regulatory framework.
Thanks, Kaushal. I'll just take one question from the audience.
I am S.N. Sharma, former director from Ministry of MSME, Government of India. My question is to all the panelists. If you see the contribution of MSME in the country development, it is 50% in the employment, 50% in the export, 50% in the other home market. But if you look into the finance, it is only 20% of the total finance to large and medium and all sectors is 20%. So my question to all the panelists is, how this timely policy making can further boost this from 20% to say 30% in another 1 or 2 years by in Web3 innovation. And
okay, so I'll just rephrase the question. Yeah.
Recently, the Prime Minister has said that large units should have
I got your question on your
ethical pressure.
Sorry, just one question, right? We'll just take it. So the question is, how could the I'm just most of the Web3 startups are all MSMEs. They all started as MSMEs. So how could you actually direct, what policy could enable funding to this sector to help them grow? So Manish, you want to take it? Kaushal?
Maybe just one suggestion over there is, I think when we talk about startups, the government has been talking a lot about startups and all. Somehow we only focus on few core areas. Either it becomes more of a health tech, ed tech, or those areas. I think from an ecosystem perspective, we need to bring Web3 as a priority from the startup ecosystem also. So how can that be reflected by the industry collaborating together to the policymakers to create the right kind of both the policy and the funding ecosystem also to it?
For a Startup India could actually have a Web3 section. Yeah, Professor, you want to say something? So what we'll do is now we'll just wrap up with one minute. So Meghna, you could answer and wrap up and then go this way, starting with you.
So I think, to your point, there is a lot of policy incoherence over here. Typically, as a startup industry, any industry, you require a champion within government. And even if you have that champion, another department can come in and derail all your good work, as we've seen most recently in gaming with the institution of the GST. So I think one is we need policy coherence, which means we need ministries to talk to each other and come out with a coherent and cohesive policy on startups across industries, and particularly consider where we are finding success, the areas in which are finding success, and come out with policies that enable rather than hinder those sectors. So that is my response to you. Is that?
No, I had a different point on this. I think both Mengda and both of you have answered that. I'm just giving you a statistic of the investment flows into India, right? From in this sphere, Web3, about 30% is going into trading and cybersecurity. And hardly 10% goes into product development. Now we, as I think the point which Meghna mentioned, if we have the right nudges, 28% GST, or if you're talking 30% GST, it should be sensitive to which segment within Web3 we need to encourage. And I'm very sure that that is where the tweaking is required. I think your point about GST, or even your point about sandboxes which you mentioned earlier, those are the areas where we need investments to be redirected. Is that happening? Because in my view, if you are going to have 15% going into trading, that does not help trading itself, right? The technology does not develop. So in the long run, that will not be very helpful for trading itself.
I think from a startup point of view, the only thing we need is transparent, consistent policy framework. If we can really get that, and as Meghna said, different ministries having one coherent point of view, I think rest the entrepreneurial zeal can take care of. That's the only thing which is needed. There are enough and more domestic use cases, and I believe this is one area where, as I mentioned before, there is no geographical boundaries, and the use cases will be global, technology will be global, and we can really build very, very large companies by Indian founders sitting in India. All we need is the right framework.
Okay, so thank you, audience, for being a great audience, and thank you, panelists, for sticking to time. So what we've really talked about today is starting with Professor Damodaran, is that, look at, a very interesting point that you made. Depending on where you start policy making from, the negative or the positive. So if you, as a timely policy making, has to start with the positives and build on it. Then we had, Manish talking about the need for supportive policy to, accelerate, grow, and linked with Professor Damodaran's last point about getting more than the 10% into actually product development, and more companies need to look at product development. Then Meghna's point about, whole of government approach and looking at the positives from global regulation, how can we apply that in India? And of course, then with Kaushal's point that we have a lot of existing regulation in India, and of course the two main concerns which both Professor Damodaran and Meghna talked about, was money laundering and financial stability, right, and taxation, right, can be taken care of, and the Indonesian example is something which you can follow. So thank you, panelists, for that great session, and I'm sure each of the sessions here, whether over the next 2 days, will also talk about a little bit of policy. And thank you once again, BW, for organizing this panel and also the opportunity for Bharat Web3 to partner. Thank you very much. And thank you, panelists.